In this lesson we're going to be looking at how you evaluate text successfully, how to understand what's required for the evaluative questions and the kind of comments that you need to make in response to those. Now, evaluation is one of the transferable English skills because you need to use it on paper 1 and paper 2. The aims of this lesson are that by the end of this you'll know which of the questions on both the exam papers for the Edexcel 9-1 English language exam requires an evaluative response as opposed to an analytical one or a comparative one. You'll understand what evaluation means in terms of the kinds of comments that the examiners are looking for, so the sorts of things you should be saying and the sorts of things you need to avoid saying that will cost you marks in the exam. That will mean that you'll be able to provide the kind of extended evaluations of both non-fiction and prose fiction texts that the examiners want to see when they're marking your responses to the questions on paper 1 and paper 2. So let's begin by just recapping which questions on the two papers require an evaluation rather than a detailed analysis. On paper 1, this is question 4. It's the last question in section A on the 19th century prose fiction text, and you will be asked to evaluate how successfully a particular element of sight has been presented in the text as a whole. On paper 2, the question in which you're asked to do a straightforward evaluation of one of the texts is question 6. This is the final question about text 2, so the second of the two non-fiction extracts, and it asks you again to evaluate how successfully a particular aspect of sight has been presented in order to engage and interest the reader. Both those questions, question 4 on paper 1 and question 6 on paper 2, are worth 15 marks. Now, there is another question on paper 2 which does require evaluative type comments, which is 7b, but I'm not going to deal with that in this lesson because that's sort of comparative evaluation, and it also requires analytical comments as well, so we'll deal with that in another session. So what is evaluation? Well, the word evaluation is a verb, it's an active verb. It means to form an idea of the value of something, to assess, to appraise, to judge. Okay, so if we look at the synonyms of evaluation, top of the list in most thesauruses is the word opinion. Evaluation is asking you to give your opinion about something, and in terms of the exam it's asking for your opinion of how well the writer of the text you're dealing with has presented one of the big aspects of their text. So it might be an idea, a theme, event, or a particular setting. You're being asked to pass judgment, so you're being asked to pass judgment on their skill as a writer, and on how good the text is, how interesting and engaging the text is. You're being asked to appraise the elements that make it effective or not so effective, and you're essentially being asked to rate the text. Does it do what it sets out to do? Does the writer present the reader with something that's interesting and engaging? So to be able to give your opinion and to provide informed, sustained judgments and appraise what aspects of the text make it good and don't make it good, you need to know the kind of basic do's and don'ts of evaluation. So evaluation, when it's done properly, will do a number of things. Evaluation will consider the effectiveness of the presentation of the aspect of sight in the text as a whole text. It will not focus in on individual paragraphs or individual events. It will consider in a very general, broad sense how well that's been done overall. Evaluation is asking you to provide a critical judgment. You're essentially being asked to become a literary critic and pass judgment on how well the writer has managed to get across their idea, their theme, or the events that they're choosing to present to you. So you will need to offer a critical, objective kind of view of it. So you need to maintain a critical detachment in the comments that you're writing. You have to maintain this overview, and you need to do that by looking at the big things in relation to these texts. So for the non-fiction text, sight means the subject matter, the ideas the writer has in relation to that, the themes that they're trying to address, so the big kind of moral social issues, and then the events that they're presenting in relation to whatever the question has asked you to evaluate. So if you keep focused on the big things, you'll avoid some of the pitfalls that tend to cost people marks. You must back up your points, your opinions. So you're being asked to give a critical judgment, to give your opinion, but you must justify those opinions by providing textual evidence. That can be in the form of direct quotations of general things like ideas or events, or you could paraphrase. Paraphrasing is perhaps one of the most useful ways of providing evidence when you're evaluating, because it allows you to refer directly to larger sections or bits of the text than you can do with quotations, because ideally you want to be using short direct quotations. And another option is references, so providing line references for maybe a couple of paragraphs that have a particular idea running through them, and then paraphrasing that idea as well. And ultimately, an evaluation that has been done well will be easy to understand for somebody who has not read the text you're writing about and who has no technical knowledge of language, of structure, of kind of English terminology, because you shouldn't be including lots of English terminology, and the quotes you're giving should be general quotes rather than specific techniques. Now, people tend to make the same kind of errors when they're writing evaluation, and there are certain things that you need to avoid which cost people marks time and time again, because these are the things that examiners keep seeing in the evaluative responses that shouldn't be there. So an evaluation should not zoom in and analyse individual words, individual phrases or techniques. Okay, what you're doing is evaluating the effectiveness of the broad idea. So there is a phrase in English, the man is more than the sum of his parts, and it means that you need to look at the whole picture to understand the person rather than just picking on individual things. And that is the same idea with evaluation. The text is more than the sum of its parts. So don't break the text down into its component parts. Remember to maintain that overview. An evaluation will not include lots of technical terminology. In fact, in the mark scheme, it says that credit can only be given for the use of technical terminology if it is very obviously related to and being used to further the critical judgment being offered. Okay, you don't need to use lots of technical terminology in relation to language and structural techniques in your evaluative responses. Evaluation must not examine the effects of individual words, phrases and techniques. Okay, so you're not looking at the minutiae of these texts. What you're doing is examining and evaluating the effects of the big things, the big ideas, the themes and the events, rather than the words and the phrases. So you're not looking so much at the how, in terms of how the writer's getting that across. You're looking at the what, the content. So evaluation focuses on content. And therefore you're not supposed to be analysing the connotations of individual words. You don't want to waste time in the exam getting really kind of bound up and tied up in possible connotations of individual words within a text. Now, none of the answers that you give in the exam should include a list of features or devices, and it certainly shouldn't appear in an evaluative response, because that's not what you're being asked to look at. You mustn't spend too long on short sections of the text. One of the common reasons that people lose marks is because they don't manage to write about the text as a whole. Now remember, when we're talking about a text for the non-fiction paper, that is going to be an extract of between 300 and 350 words. So it's not a long text. It's not like you're being asked to evaluate a whole novel or a short story. It will be a short extract. So there really isn't any reason why you can't write about the whole extract in the time that's available. Okay, so they were some basic general do's and don'ts. In order to evaluate properly, it's good to understand the conventions of evaluation, and actually there are lots of real life everyday examples of this that you can look at as you're preparing for the evaluative questions. So the world we live in is full of opinions, and because we exist in this kind of digital age and the age of 24-hour news, those critical evaluations, those opinions, those appraisals are everywhere. So when we do online shopping, most of the shops we use online will have a facility where customers can provide reviews. One obvious example is Amazon. If you go to buy something on Amazon, you can click on the customer reviews and you can read through those, and there's always two little boxes at the bottom that ask you to say whether the review was helpful or not helpful. Now, if you've ever looked at those, the kinds of reviews that are helpful are the ones that justify the comments they're making. So a review that says, don't buy this product, it's a complete waste of money, when I plugged it into my computer it made it crash and it wasn't compatible with the system I'm running. That's helpful. So you would click yes for that, to say that's helpful. But on the other hand, if somebody posts a review for the product that says, don't waste your money on this, it's a load of rubbish, you would click no, because that doesn't tell you why it's a waste of money and a load of rubbish. And that is a convention that you need to use in your more formal academic evaluations, because you need to remember to justify your opinion so the examiner understands why you believe a certain thing about the text. Comment posts on social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter and YouTube are evaluative comments. They're people passing judgment on the posts and the content that other people put up there. So look at the sorts of comments that you get. And again, the ones that are not so good are the ones that are just like or not like, or the ones that just say, no, don't agree with this, or this is rubbish, because you don't know why. There's no justification for that. The ones that people tend to read and the ones that are more useful for other users are the ones that explain why people like or don't like certain posts or certain content. TV reviews, we're getting into kind of classical, typical, traditional evaluative writing. So any TV listings magazine, whether it's printed or online, will contain reviews. That is evaluative. The TV critic is being paid to give their opinion, to evaluate, and they will back it up by referring in general terms to things that happen within that TV show. Similarly, book reviews, again, Amazon is a good place to look for that. Other bookseller sites are also really good to have a look there, and the extended ones are really useful because they're very much the kind of style that you're aiming for when you're writing your evaluative responses. And then of course film reviews. So TV, book and film reviews all do the same thing. They're reviewing something as a text, they are offering an opinion on how good it is, and they are backing up those opinions with evidence from those particular texts. So evaluation, whether it's on Amazon, YouTube, film reviews, whatever it might be, is about giving your opinion and supporting it, proving it and justifying it by referring to specific details about the thing that you're appraising. Now, you can find lots of different reviews. In the lesson, we listened to the podcast, an extract from the podcast from Mark Kermode and Simon Mayo evaluating the film Fences, and in there you could hear them talking in general terms. They were referring to the actors, they were referring to particular events in the film to justify their opinions. Okay, so if you want to listen to an evaluative response, those 5 Live podcasts are a good place to look. So in terms of successful evaluation, a successful evaluation will form an opinion based on the overall effectiveness of the text, and for the exam that is the overall effectiveness of the presentation of the aspect of sight that's specified in the question. And what it won't do is break it down into individual elements, so individual language and structural devices. A successful evaluation will have a clear line of argument. The person writing it will have decided on their opinion, and they will present that persuasively as they go through. So you need to include some of those persuasive language techniques in your evaluation so that the examiner comes to agree with you by the end of your response. Successful evaluations will deal with the whole text rather than individual paragraphs. They will treat it as a whole thing. the opinion will be developed and sustained and critical. So the judgments will be supported by referring to particular examples from the text, but not examples of language and structural techniques, but rather examples of key ideas, key themes, key events running through there. An evaluation will include supporting evidence, and for the purposes of the exam, you are being asked to provide a PED essay, a point evidence explanation development evaluative essay, and we'll look at what that means a little bit later in this session. So you can do that by using direct quotations embedded into your own writing as you do with your analytical responses, paraphrasing and references, and I would suggest that paraphrasing is a very good way of ensuring that you remain focused on the bigger things, whereas direct quotation can sometimes lead you into analysis that is too detailed and too focused on specific techniques. Successful evaluation does not need to use lots of technical terminology. If you listen to those film reviews that you get on 5 Live, anybody can understand what they're saying. You can understand the opinions, you can understand why they're choosing the examples they're choosing. They don't go into lots of detail about diegetic and non-diegetic sound, mise-en-scène, high-angle camera lenses, different types of lighting. They don't tend to use that. Occasionally Mark Hermo does, but they keep it general so that the ordinary members of the public can understand what they're saying. Successful evaluations will always end with a final concluding summative statement which expresses the opinion that's been offered directly and succinctly, and ideally supports it with one final sort of killer bit of evidence from the text that just hammers home why that opinion is correct. Okay, so they are general points about evaluating. Let's look now at how you do this practically in terms of evaluating a non-fiction text on paper 2 in response to question 6. So you have to form a judgment, and what you need to do first of all, as with all of these, is to read the question really carefully. A common reason for people to lose marks is because they don't identify the aspect of sight that they're being asked to write about, they're being asked to evaluate, and they just go off on a tangent or write too vaguely about the text. So there's a lack of focus for the evaluation. Take highlighters into the exam with you and highlight the particular aspect of sight that you are being asked to evaluate. The general wording of the question will always be the same. It is just that aspect of sight that you need to be aware of. You will have read the text through. You'll have skim read it, so you'll have got an idea of the subject matters, the key ideas, the themes and the events, and when you've gone back and read for meaning, you should have been annotating that text with notes about those bigger elements, those elements of sight. Go back and look at those in relation to the question and decide which ones you're going to use. Remember that although you must accept the premise of the question, that the aspect specified in the question has been successfully presented, there are degrees of success. So if you think it's partially successful and you can argue the case persuasively using your annotations and evidence from the text, that's fine. What you cannot do and what they will not accept is a response that just says, I don't think this text was successful at all. I didn't like the events, I didn't like the ideas, I don't agree with the themes, I don't think the writer did a good job. You can't do that. Okay, you have to accept to some degree that it has been successful and find evidence to prove that. So before you start writing, you need to decide what your opinion is and how you're going to prove that using the annotations you've got. You haven't got time to create a written plan for this in the exam. You're only going to be spending around 15 minutes answering this question, but you need to be clear in your head so that you've got this clear opinion, this clear line of argument that you can develop as you work your way through. You can sustain it and support it with textual evidence. So what do you comment on then in these non-fiction texts for the evaluation questions? Well, it's the big things, it's the ideas. What views is the writer expressing about their subject matter, about their themes? In terms of their themes, how do the views expressed by the writer relate to wider social, political, ethical issues, whatever it might be? What message are they trying to get across to the readers with this text and the way that they're presenting their subject matter. And then look at the events. You will have a relatively short text extract. It will be 300 to 350 words long, so there will, whatever's in there in terms of events are important because the writer has chosen to include those. So think about what those events are, how they relate to each other, what order are they presented in. So are they using a chronological linear structure in there? So are you getting the events in the right order, or are they jumping around a bit? How are they being presented to make it interesting? Okay, so how do you comment effectively? We know what to comment, but how do you do it? Well, you need to make sure that every single comment you make in your responses relates to the specific focus of the question. As I said earlier, one of the main reasons people lose marks is that they just don't answer the question that's been set. So make sure you're clear about that before you start writing. Work your way chronologically through the text. You have to cover the whole of the text, but start at the beginning. It gives a nice structure to your response, and it shows the examiner that you are working your way through it. Comment on the big things like tone, key ideas, key themes, key events, and use evaluative language. So words like successfully, effectively, convincingly, throughout, overall. It shows you're maintaining a broad overview. Remember to use textual evidence from throughout the text, from different parts of the text. You have to be writing in paid paragraphs, so there should be some textual evidence in every single paragraph, but try to avoid getting stuck on any one particular area of the text because that will cost you marks. The comments you make need to focus on the general effect of the aspects you're referring to and you're quoting in terms of the reader's engagement. So whenever you quote a bit of evidence from the text, or you paraphrase, or you refer to something, you need to explain how that particular thing is making the text engaging for the reader. What effect is that going to have on the reader's response to the text? And then you need to end with a final statement that sums up your opinion of the effectiveness of the text as a whole. Okay, restate your opinion clearly. If you can, find a really powerful bit of evidence from the text so that you leave the examiner in no doubt what your opinion was and the fact that you've proved it, you've justified it. Right, let's look at some good and bad evaluative comments now to understand what evaluative comments should look like. Okay, so here is our first example. So here's this comment. It says, using the metaphor, catching the light in a spectral play of colour at the start makes life in the high Arctic seem magical, almost like a Disney fairy tale land. This isn't a good evaluative comment. You can see that they have named the language device, the figurative device, the use of a metaphor, and they have analysed that in far too much detail. So that is not a good evaluative comment. That's not the kind of thing that we want to see. Okay, so we'll put that in the no pile over there. If we look at this comment, the combination of literary devices such as metaphors, personification, sensory language with rhetorical devices such as three-part lists, emotive language and facts makes this an engaging and original presentation of life in the high Arctic. Again, this is not an evaluative comment. This is feature spotting. So they've listed very specific language devices, literary devices and rhetorical devices. They should not be listing them. They should not be focusing on those things in the evaluation. And also there isn't really any focus on the question. They just say in a very general way, this is an engaging and original presentation of life in the high Arctic. It's quite hard to see what the question was from that response. So because this is listing, it's focusing on specific language devices and it isn't focusing on the question set. This is not a good evaluative response. So this one also goes into the no pile. That's the kind of thing you need to avoid. So we've got 2 in there. We look at this next one. The writer helps the reader to understand the hardships of life in the high Arctic. Again, this isn't evaluative, it's not analytical, it's just an assertion. It's unsupported. There's no evidence from the text. It's an opinion, yes, but it doesn't have any textual evidence to support that. So again, you need to avoid these unsupported assertions in your evaluative responses. So that one also goes over to the no pile. Okay, let's have a look at this response. The writer engages the readers in what life is like in the high Arctic by combining very vivid, detailed literary descriptions of the location with very factual, serious accounts of what the people have to do to survive. This is okay, actually. This is all right as the start of a PED paragraph evaluating how the writer of this text has engaged the readers in life in the high Arctic. They've referred in general terms to the style, so they're talking about the literary descriptions and the factual accounts. So they're talking about the style of the writing, and that's a big thing. That's one of the overview things. So actually, as an evaluative response, this is okay as a starting point. Obviously, there would need to be some textual evidence to justify that, and then a bit more detailed explanation. So that one we can put in the yes pile. That is the sort of thing that you need to be aiming for. And let's have a look at this one. The descriptions of the landscape in the opening paragraph create the impression of an enchanted, almost magical place, establishing a reverential tone which is engaging for the reader as it challenges their assumptions about what life in the high Arctic is like. This is a good evaluative comment. They are focusing on a particular part of the text in detail, so they're focusing on the description in the opening paragraph. This comes from early on in the response. They've started at the beginning of the text. They are commenting on the effect in a general way that those descriptions have. So they're saying that the descriptions of the landscape create an impression of an enchanted, almost magical place. And they are commenting also on this big idea of tone, establishing a reverential tone, and they are suggesting why that is engaging for the reader, because it challenges their assumptions, so the reader's going to want to read on. They don't need to use that rather empty phrase, it will make the reader want to read on, because that's obvious. Okay, so this is the best of the responses that we've got, because it focuses on a very particular section of the text, on a particular aspect, which is the description. It comments on the effect of that description, and it develops that by suggesting how that makes it engaging for the reader. So there is also a focus on the requirements of the question that has been set. So that one goes over into the yes pile. So you can see from the list of comments in the no pile that anything that includes lots of technical language, really detailed analysis of particular language or structural devices, lists of technical terms, or general assertion needs to be avoided. You can see in the tick pile, in the yes pile, that comments that focus in a general way on the effect of the text on a reader in response to the question are the kinds of things that you should be providing. Okay, so let's sum up then how to evaluate a text. Evaluation offers a particular an opinion on how successfully a writer has presented a particular aspect of sight. Evaluations must focus on the effectiveness of this in the text as a whole, rather than getting bogged down in individual sections. The opinions being offered have to be justified by using supporting evidence. That supporting evidence needs to relate to big things within the text, such as the subject matter, the ideas, the themes, the events, rather than very specific individual language and structural devices. In terms of how you provide that supporting evidence, it can be in the form of short direct quotations embedded into your own writing, paraphrasing, or referencing. Evaluative PED paragraphs in your responses need to be as follows. The point should be the opinion that you're offering, and this should really be the topic sentence of each new paragraph. The evidence needs then to be some kind of supporting textual evidence of a relevant aspect of sight, and that could be a quotation, it could be, as we saw in that really good example a moment ago, a reference to something within the text, a reference to a section of the text. The explanation then needs to focus on how that supporting evidence justifies the opinion offered in terms of the effect that that bit of evidence has on the reader's response to the element of sight, on how it helps to engage the reader in the text. And then the development at the end of your PED paragraph needs to develop your opinion with further justification of it through an additional textual reference or quote or bit of paraphrasing. So in that last comment that we looked at, they talked about, they'd begun by talking about the opening paragraph and saying that it created the impression of being an enchanted magical place. They then developed that by talking about the fact that it also sets a reverential tone. Okay, so that was a good example of a PED paragraph. So evaluation, offer an opinion, maintain a critical overview, and support your opinions with textual evidence related to the big things, subject matters, ideas, themes and events.